Hey there, and welcome to True Scary Stories. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. That helps YouTube know you love creepy stories, and it'll keep sending more your way.
Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're new here, I want to warn you right now, these aren't your typical campfire stories. These are the kind of accounts that come from real people. People who went into the woods expecting one thing and came out, if they came out at all, completely changed. Tonight, I have 3 stories for you. Each one takes place deep in the woods, far from any road, far from any help. So get comfortable, turn the lights down if you want, and let's get into it. Story 1, The Watcher on the Ridge. So this story was shared with me by a guy named Cole. Cole was 26 years old at the time this happened, and he describes himself as an experienced outdoorsman. He'd been hiking and camping since he was a kid. His dad used to take him out into the backcountry every summer, so he wasn't someone who scared easily. He knew the woods. He respected them. But what happened to Cole during a solo trip in the Appalachian backcountry in late October, he says it permanently changed the way he thinks about being alone out there. He'd planned the trip for weeks, 5 days, solo, no trail. He wanted to go off the beaten path, real deep wilderness, no other hikers, no campsites, no noise, just him and nature. He drove out on a Thursday morning, parked his truck at a small dirt pullout off a forest road, and started walking. By mid-afternoon, he was already deep enough that he couldn't hear the distant sound of the highway anymore, just wind, leaves, birds. He said it felt perfect. He set up camp that first night near a dry creek bed, got a small fire going, ate his meal, and was in his tent by 9. He slept great, no issues. Day 2 was equally peaceful. He pushed deeper north, crossed a ridgeline, and found himself in this beautiful, dense section of old-growth forest. Massive trees, thick canopy, barely any underbrush. He remembers thinking it looked almost unnatural how clean and quiet it was in there, like the forest floor had been swept. He made a note of that thought later, that the area felt almost too quiet. No squirrels, no bird calls, no rustling in the leaves, just silence. He brushed it off, set up camp again, got a fire going. It was around 10:30 that night when he first noticed something was off. He was sitting by the dying fire, just watching the embers, when he got this feeling on the back of his neck. You know that feeling. It's primal. Something in your brain just goes cold and says, something is watching you. Cole said he'd felt that feeling before out in the woods, and it had always turned out to be nothing. A deer nearby, maybe, a raccoon. So he didn't panic. He just slowly looked up and scanned the tree line around him. At first, he didn't see anything, but then he looked up the ridge to the north. There was a rocky slope that rose maybe 60, 70 feet above his campsite, and he saw a shape just standing there at the top of the ridge between 2 trees, completely still. It was dark, obviously, but there was enough light filtering through the canopy that he could make out a silhouette. And what he saw was the shape of a person, standing completely still, just watching him. Cole said his first thought was that it was another hiker, maybe someone who'd seen his fire and stopped. He said he even raised a hand and waved, thinking maybe the person would wave back or come down and say hello. The figure didn't move. He called out, said something like, "Hey, you okay up there?" Nothing, no response. The figure just stayed there, perfectly still, like a statue. Cole said the hair on his arms stood straight up at that point. He grabbed his flashlight and shined it up at the ridge. The beam wasn't quite strong enough to fully illuminate the spot, but he could see just enough. And in that brief flash of light, what he noticed was that the figure was tall, unusually tall, and the way it was standing wasn't quite right. The proportions seemed off somehow. He couldn't place it exactly. He just knew that looking at it made him feel deeply physically wrong inside. He decided the smart move was to go into his tent, zip it up, and wait. So that's what he did. He lay there in his sleeping bag, heart pounding, listening. And for a while, maybe 20 minutes, there was nothing, no sound at all. Then he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the leaves, coming down the ridge towards his campsite. Cole said he stopped breathing. He lay completely still. The footsteps got closer and closer, and then they stopped, right outside his tent, like directly outside. He said he could hear breathing, slow, deep, rhythmic breathing, just on the other side of the thin nylon wall. He stayed frozen for what felt like an hour. He was too scared to move, too scared to make a sound. Eventually, and he doesn't know how long it actually took, the footsteps started again, slowly moving away, back up the ridge, until the sound faded out completely. Cole did not sleep that night. When dawn came, he unzipped his tent and looked outside. The campsite was undisturbed. His fire was cold. His gear was exactly where he'd left it. But in the soft dirt right outside the tent door, there were footprints, large ones. He took photos. He said they looked like bare human feet, but the stride length was enormous. Whoever or whatever had been standing outside his tent had feet bigger than any person he'd ever seen, and the depth of the impressions in the dirt suggested something extremely heavy. Cole packed up his camp at about 10 minutes flat and started walking south, back towards his truck. He says he hiked the entire way back without stopping, about 14 miles, and he did it in less than 5 hours. He never looked back. He got to his truck, drove home, and didn't tell anyone what happened for almost 2 years. He said part of him still tries to find rational explanations. Maybe another hiker. Maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him in the dark. But then he thinks about those footprints and the breathing right outside his tent, and he can't explain it away. Cole hasn't done a solo overnight in the woods since.
Story 2. The Cabin That Wasn't on Any Map. This next story comes from a woman named Dina. Dina was 31 when this happened, and she was on a hiking trip with her boyfriend, a guy named Ray. They were both outdoorsy people, both in good shape, both experienced with multi-day wilderness trips. They'd done plenty of hikes together before. Nothing had ever gone seriously wrong. They were hiking in a remote section of national forest in the Pacific Northwest. Deep, dense, wet forest. The kind of place where the trees are so tall you sometimes lose sight of the sky entirely. It had been raining for 2 days straight when things started to go sideways. On day 3 of their trip, they got turned around. Dina is the first to admit it. They made a navigation mistake. They'd been relying on a paper topo map and a compass, but visibility was low because of fog and rain, and somewhere along a ridge they lost their bearing. By mid-afternoon, they knew they were off course, but they weren't sure by how much. They kept moving, hoping to pick up a trail or a landmark they recognized. By 4 o'clock, with the light already starting to fade and rain still coming down, they started to feel that creeping edge of panic. Not full panic, but that early warning sign. The quiet kind, where you and your partner don't talk about it, but you both know. And then, Ray spotted something through the trees. A structure. Brown, wooden, barely visible through the fog. They pushed through the underbrush toward it and found a cabin. Old but solid looking, small, maybe 1 room, log construction, metal roof, a covered porch with a woodpile stacked on one end. Dina said her first feeling was pure relief. A cabin meant they could get out of the rain, and if there was a cabin, there might be a trail nearby that led to a road. They called out, knocked on the door. No answer. Ray tried the handle. Unlocked. They pushed the door open and went inside. The inside was damp and smelled like old wood and something else, something musty and organic that Dina couldn't identify. There was a small table, 2 chairs, a wood stove in the corner, and a cot along one wall with a folded wool blanket on it. There were shelves on the wall with a few canned goods, some old tools, a lantern. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but the place looked structurally sound and dry. No broken windows, no holes in the roof. Ray found some dry wood in a box near the stove and got a fire going. They stripped off their wet outer layers and hung them up. For a few minutes, it almost felt cozy. Dina remembers laughing at something Ray said, the tension starting to break. They decided they'd spend the night here, wait out the rain, and figure out their route in the morning. As the fire got going and the light in the cabin improved, Dina started looking more closely at the interior. And that's when she noticed the walls. Every inch of wall space that wasn't covered by shelving or the stovepipe was covered in writing. Not casual graffiti-style writing, not casual scrawling, dense, careful, small handwriting covering every surface from floor to about 5 feet high. Words and numbers and what looked like partial sentences written over and over in tight rows. In some places, the writing was so thick it had layered on top of itself and become illegible. Dina moved closer with the lantern and tried to read some of it. Most of it didn't make sense, fragments, things like, "It comes when the rain comes," and "Don't go past the stones," and "The third night is the worst," and "You will hear it before you see it." She said some of it was clearly the same phrase repeated dozens of times, like someone writing lines as punishment in school, just filling the wall with the same words over and over. One phrase she said she found in at least 4 different spots on the walls was, "Leave before it finds you here." She showed Ray. He read some of it, and his face went pale. They both agreed it was probably just some disturbed person who'd used this cabin as a kind of shelter, maybe someone who'd had some kind of psychological break out here. It was unsettling, but it didn't necessarily mean anything dangerous. They ate, kept the fire going, and tried to sleep. Ray took the cot. Dina made a sleeping pad from her rain gear on the floor. Sometime in the night, she thinks it was around 2 or 3 in the morning, she woke up. The fire had burned down to coals. The cabin was dark except for the faint orange glow from the stove's air vent, and outside, in the rain, she could hear something. Footsteps on the porch. She sat up immediately. Ray was still asleep. She listened. The footsteps moved slowly across the porch, from one end to the other, and then stopped at the door. She shook Ray awake. He came to quickly. She must have looked terrified because he went from groggy to alert in about half a second. They both sat there in the dark, listening. A knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Ray grabbed his hiking pole, the only thing either of them had that could function as a weapon, and they both stared at the door. Neither of them moved to open it. Neither of them spoke. Dina said she felt like if she made any sound at all, something terrible would happen. The knocking came again. 3 more knocks, same rhythm, slow, patient, and then silence. They waited. A minute passed, then 5. The rain kept falling. The porch was quiet. After about 20 minutes, Ray crept to the small window near the door and looked out. He couldn't see anything in the dark and rain. No light, no movement, nothing on the porch. They didn't sleep again. They sat together by the stove until the sky outside began to lighten. The second the dawn came, they packed up everything and left. Outside, in the mud on the porch, there were no footprints. The rain had washed everything clean. There was no evidence anyone or anything had been there at all. It took them most of the day to find their way back to the trailhead. When they finally got back to their car and drove to the nearest town, Dina pulled out her phone and tried to look up the cabin. She tried cross-referencing the general area with ranger station records, land use maps, any historical records of structures in that section of forest. She found nothing. Not a single record of any cabin in that area. No hunting cabin, no fire lookout, no historical homestead. Nothing. As far as any official record is concerned, that cabin doesn't exist. And yet, someone, something, knocked on its door in the middle of the night. Dina told me she thinks about the writing on the walls a lot, specifically that one phrase, "Leave before it finds you here." She thinks they left just in time. She doesn't want to think about what might have happened if they'd stayed for a second night.
Story 3. The Trail That Led Somewhere Else. The last story tonight is the one that bothers me the most personally. It comes from a guy named Theo. Theo was 43 years old, a high school biology teacher, a runner, and an avid trail runner specifically. He'd run some serious races, 50 milers, 100K, that kind of thing. This guy was deeply comfortable in the woods. Fast, fit, experienced, and level-headed. He's the kind of person you'd want with you if things went wrong. What he described to me, he said he's never been able to explain, and I believe him. It was a Saturday morning in early September. Theo went out for what he planned as a long training run, about 22 miles, on a trail system he'd run many times before in a large state forest about 40 minutes from his house. He knew these trails by heart. He'd been running them for years. He knew every fork, every landmark, every stream crossing. It was his home turf. He started at 7 in the morning. The weather was perfect. Cool, clear, low humidity. He was in a great mood. He had his hydration vest, enough food and water for the run, his phone, and a small emergency kit he always carried. Not because he thought he'd need it, just habit. The first 8 or 9 miles were completely normal. He was hitting his pace, feeling good, watching the light change as the sun came up through the trees. He passed a few landmarks he recognized, an old stone wall that cut through the forest, a particular boulder he always used as a mile marker, a creek crossing with a narrow wooden footbridge. All normal, all exactly as he remembered. And then, at around the 9-mile mark, something changed. He came around a bend on a section of trail he knew well. It should have opened up onto a wide fire road that cut through the forest, a road he'd crossed hundreds of times. Instead, he found himself in a part of the forest he'd never seen before. He stopped, looked around. The trail behind him looked normal, but ahead of him, instead of the fire road, there was just more forest. Old, dense, dark forest with no trail markers and no familiar landmarks, just trees in every direction. Theo figured he'd somehow gotten onto a side trail without noticing. Maybe he'd been zoning out, gone into that running trance where the miles just disappeared. It happened. He wasn't worried. He pulled out his phone to check his GPS running app. No signal, which wasn't shocking for deep woods, but he also noticed something that did bother him. His GPS track showed him on the main trail, right where he expected to be. According to his phone, he was exactly on course, but what he was seeing with his own eyes didn't match the map at all. He decided to backtrack, run back the way he came, find the fire road, reorient. He turned around and started running back along the trail. After about 10 minutes, he came to that wooden footbridge over the creek. Good, a landmark he knew. He crossed it and kept going. After another 10 minutes, he expected to see the boulder he always used as a mile marker. He never reached it. After 20 minutes of running back the way he came, he started seeing things that didn't match his memory at all. The trail was narrower than he remembered. The trees were different, older, bigger, with thick moss covering the trunks in a way he'd never noticed before. And the light was wrong. The angle of the sunlight filtering through the canopy suggested it was late afternoon, but it should have been around 9:30 in the morning. Theo stopped again. He checked his watch. It said 9:47 a.m., but the light outside said otherwise. He tried calling out. No answer, just silence. He tried his phone again, still no data signal, but he tried to call. The call connected briefly, then dropped. He picked a direction, north based on his compass app, and started moving. He pushed through underbrush, off trail, just trying to find anything familiar. A road, a power line cut, a stream, anything. He ran for what his watch said was 40 minutes, and then he smelled smoke. He followed the smell and broke out of the tree line into a small clearing, and there was a camp. Not a hiker's camp, something older looking. A fire ring with a low burning fire, some kind of rough shelter made from branches and bark, a few objects Theo couldn't quite make out hanging from the trees around the clearing. He called out. A man stepped out from behind the shelter. Old, very old, long gray beard, worn clothing that Theo said looked almost historical, not like costume historical, just old, worn down. The man looked at Theo with an expression that Theo described as unsurprised, like he'd been expecting him. Theo asked where he was, asked how to get back to the main trail, back to the fire road, back to the trailhead. The old man looked at him for a long moment and then pointed south. He said, and these are the exact words Theo remembers,
Go south. Don't stop. Don't look at anything that calls to you from the trees. Just go south and don't stop. Theo asked who he was, how long he'd been out here. The old man just shook his head slowly and said, "Go south, now." Theo went south. He ran. He didn't look into the trees, even though, and this is the part that makes his voice change when he tells this story, twice as he ran through that thick old forest, he heard something calling to him. Not a voice exactly, more like a sound that his brain kept trying to interpret as his name, a sound that made him want to stop and turn toward it. Both times he forced himself to keep running, kept his eyes forward. After about 25 minutes, he burst out of the trees and found himself standing on the fire road, the actual fire road, exactly where it should have been. He knew exactly where he was. It was 10:45 in the morning. He'd lost almost an hour that his watch, which had been running the whole time, couldn't account for. His GPS track for that missing stretch was just a straight line, a clean data gap. He ran the 12 miles back to the trailhead without stopping, drove home, sat in his driveway for a long time. He went back the following weekend and tried to find the section of forest he ended up in. He searched for the clearing, he searched for the fire ring, he searched for any sign of that old man or any kind of camp. He found nothing, just ordinary forest, the same trails he'd always known. He's never been able to explain the missing time, he's never been able to find the clearing, and he's never been able to figure out who that old man was, how he survived alone out there, or how he knew that Theo was coming. But the thing that bothers Theo most isn't the lost hour or the impossible geography. It's that twice as he was running back through those trees, something called to him, and part of him, some deep, irrational part, wanted to stop and answer it. He's grateful he didn't. And that's where I'll leave you tonight. 3 people, 3 separate trips into the woods, 3 experiences they can't explain and can't forget. Cole with the figure on the ridge, Dina and Ray in the cabin that should not exist, and Theo running through a forest that seemed to exist somewhere just slightly outside of the one we all know. I don't know what to make of these stories. I really don't. But I'll tell you this. Every single one of these people told me the same thing when I asked them if they'd go back. They all paused, and they all said no. Not because of fear exactly, but because some part of them felt like they'd been allowed to leave, like whatever was out there had made a choice to let them go. And none of them wanted to test whether it would make that same choice twice. Stay safe out there, and if you're ever deep in the woods and something feels wrong, trust that feeling. Get out. Don't wait to see if it gets worse. I'll see you in the next one.